Today we're focusing on one of the biggest loadout mistakes, and that is the combination of sustained fire recoil attachments and initial firing recoil attachments. And this kind of popped up probably about 3 or 4 months ago, kind of when Sim got a little bit popular. If you guys aren't familiar with the site, I have covered it in the past, and there's a category that kind of explains these on the website. And the main thing we're looking at when we're looking at these attachments is the initial gun kick, the initial view kick, as well as sustained gun kick and sustained view kick. What you'll notice is if we go all in on initial recoil, we can actually get these numbers quite low. Obviously, when you multiply whatever that recoil is by 0.52, it's going to cut that down drastically, and it's going to be for those first 5 shots. Obviously, the sustained recoil will be down here. I know it may sound complicated, but you'll notice is as soon as we go ahead and put on something like polymer, it's going to go ahead and kind of modify this number. We're not actually getting any benefit from using polymer, and that's because a brace overrides it and counteracts it. So it's like we equipped nothing with polymer. It's like it didn't do anything, versus if we go ahead and get rid of that, you can see kind of what's happening over here, and that has to do with the stock. So if we go ahead and kind of look through these, you can see that polymer is helping out by about 4% on this particular category. If we go to tight grip, you'll see it helps by an additional 10%, and it'll counteract whatever is happening with that initial recoil. So what that means, generally, you want to go ahead and combine everything that is sustained recoil or normal vertical recoil, recoil control, or horizontal recoil, or everything initial recoil and those things, but not to combine initial recoil with sustained recoil, because there will be this canceling effect. If we go down here, we can see that this one has sustained recoil, so that one's going to help lower this number even further. And just to give you kind of a comparison, it's going to be different on each and every gun, and that's what I've done here is I combined the Cooper carbine and went for the lowest sustained recoil, which is usually about 3 attachments because it does have tight grip. The lowest initial recoil, which it includes brace, which helps out there. AS44 only has a rear grip and a stock, since it doesn't have any of those other attachments as perks. So it'll be pretty simple, and we'll go ahead and check out the comparison now. So what you can see on the screen is the Cooper carbine. On the left, it's full sustained recoil, and on the right, it's the full initial firing recoil. And you can see there's a dramatic difference in their recoil patterns. The initial recoil starts off with no recoil initially, then it has a long recoil pattern that basically goes off the building, versus the one on the left has sustained recoil from beginning to end. The tight grip will be there. One thing to keep in mind is that is important for the Cooper carbine to have good sustained recoil, because its initial recoil isn't all that crazy. If we had a similar concept for the XM4, where it has that initial kick that a lot of people struggle with, and then it has pretty good sustained recoil, we'd probably go all in on initial firing recoil, and that's what we're going to see next with the AS44. But one thing I'll point out about the Cooper carbine before we get into the AS44, because it will differ slightly when we get into the AS44, is that even though the recoil patterns can be different, it doesn't necessarily mean one is going to be easier or harder based off that recoil pattern automatically. Because in this particular case, the one on the left, 100% is significantly easier to control and shoot at range. When we go to the AS44, which we'll see now, it's actually the opposite. Even though the one on the right has the higher recoil pattern, it has a very consistent recoil pattern from beginning to end, because we tackle that initial recoil pattern. Versus if we go with the one on the left, which is all sustained, we have that initial kick, which is a little bit harder to struggle with. Maybe on keyboard and mouse, maybe not as much, because you can adjust on the fly, versus on a controller, you have to find that sweet spot, which if the sweet spot is changing, that it becomes a very high skill or hard to use weapon because of the inconsistency. So the one on the right, although it does have significantly more vertical recoil overall, the actual ease of use is way easier to control the one on the right, because you don't have to change anything. It starts how it finishes all the way through. It's consistent. Versus the one on the left, you get the initial kick. That's a little bit hard to control because there's some space, and then it gets super consistent from about 5 or 6 shots all the way to the end, which that's the part where you're going to control. But by that time, you may have already lost the gunfight. It makes it very hard to take people off head glitches. So you have to weigh that in when you're building a loadout. And now we're going to take a look at those classes. Obviously for the Cooper, I'm going to recommend the sustained firing. And for the AS44, I would go with the initial fire recoil and try those out for yourself. So for the Cooper build, this is what we're going to use: the MX silencer with the Cooper custom, the hand stop, and you go ahead and try whatever else you want, but that's the one that I felt worked the best with the 60 round lengthen. And we got the 3-6X, which is the meta optic for all Vanguard, and that's kind of what separates it from Cold War and Modern Warfare. And then we're using 3 attachments for sustained firing and recoil, and that's the Cooper custom padded, which has the accuracy during recoil, during sustained firing, and the initial firing recoil gets canceled out. So that negative isn't even a real negative when it comes to having a negative. Then we go ahead and use the tight grip, which is going to help with that as well. And then obviously polymer, even though it's been nerfed, it stacks on top of these. Or you could go with another attachment that would be specifically for recoil, but that had nothing to do with initial recoil. So that would be where something maybe like the hatch would come in, the rubber grip if you only cared about vertical. So you get a little bit more flexibility there if you do want to veer away from polymer, since it's helping out the least out of all the other 3 sustained firing. Then when it comes to AS44, we have a similar scenario where we're going to use the MX silencer, the Kavalskaya 615mm Carver, because it mainly has vertical, and then we have the Gorenko 50 round lengthen, and then we're using disabled for the extra bullet velocity, fully loaded, the 3-6X, and there's only those 2 attachments. And since this is the biggest problem with the AS44, if you're going to use this for long, medium, long range, primarily on a Rebirth or Fortune's Keep, gets really hard on Caldera because the damage per mag, unless you're in solos, you're going to go with the exact custom, which helps with the initial firing recoil, and then stippled, which is going to help with that initial firing recoil, and that'll give you a consistent pattern. Although it is longer, like I said, you're not going to miss those first shots, which are crucial and the most important. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section. Appreciate all the support. Thank you for watching. As always, have a great day.